Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Marissa Kozlov, and it is great to have you with us for our last eMarketer Tech Talk of 2023. Today, our guests will reveal insights from their recent survey that explore the key changes on the horizon for iOS and Android and how prepared app marketers are for 2024. So with that said, let me introduce my three guests. First, we have Sara Camden, Head of Product Marketing and App Performance at InMobi, joining us today from Indianapolis. Sara, good to see you.
Pleasure to be here, Marissa.
Happy to have you with us. We also have Nicole Perrin, Senior Vice President of Business Intelligence at Advertiser Perceptions, based in Chicago. Nicole, nice to have you with us today.
Hey, Marissa, great to be back.
So happy to have you back. And from Sandpoint, Idaho, we have Mark Kellog, Senior Product Manager at Kochava. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Marissa. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. This is going to be a great conversation today. So before we get into it, just as a reminder to our audience, let's keep it conversational today for our last Tech Talk of the year. Just use the chat window on the right to tell us where you're joining us from and also to submit your questions. We'll do our best to get to as many of your live questions as we can during the Q&A in the second part of the show, so please keep those coming. All right, as promised, we have a great conversation planned for you today. So Sara, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And thank you to all of you out there for joining us on a Friday, taking some time out to be at the last eMarketer Tech Talk of the year. So hopefully we close it out on a good note. Before we kind of dive into looking ahead, I thought it'd be great to start by looking back at a little bit of what we learned so far when it comes to privacy on mobile, both from the iOS standpoint as well as Android. I think probably most of the people on the line are pretty familiar with app tracking transparency, the big shakeup. It was announced in 2020 and then rolled out in 2021 in the spring. And then that came with what's known as SK Ad Network, excuse me, or SCAN. SCAN actually predated app tracking transparency. It came out in 2018, but there wasn't a whole lot of reason for folks to use it. So it kind of went relatively unnoticed. But once, IDFA, or the identifier for advertisers, became more limited, SCAN sort of emerged more to the forefront. And the good news is, there's been a steady cadence of improvements over the last few years. Apple seems very invested in making it a workable solution, from adding multi-touch attribution back in SCAN 3, and then SCAN 4, you get more postbacks. And then they did announce this past summer SCAN 5, which they actually said would be coming by the end of this year. We don't have any more details on it other than that the big feature that they revealed was that it would support remarketing, but I'm definitely keeping a close eye on that and wondering if we'll still see something before the end of the year. If anybody has noticed anything today, please put it in the chat and maybe we can chat about it. And then also when SCAN 5 got announced this past summer, another feature got announced called Privacy Manifests, which came out in iOS 17 in sort of a grace period fashion, but we'll dig into that a little bit more later. And then on the Android standpoint, so Privacy Sandbox for Chrome browser, that's been in play for a little while. It's supposedly going to go into effect this coming year. They're testing it on, I think, 1% of cookies right now that are getting deprecated, third-party cookies, that is. But then they've got the companion, the Privacy Sandbox for Android, which got announced in 2022. It's actively beta testing right now. I know InMobi, where I am, is testing, and Kochava is as well. And it is actually supposed to launch by the end of 2024, based on Google's timelines that are announced so far. Now, it's anybody's guess if they'll stick to that. They're known for kicking the can down the road here and there. But anyway, we're certainly planning like that's the case.
Awesome. So just to build upon a little bit of what Sara set the stage for, Apple, beginning in iOS 14 and above, implemented a framework for a developer to request the consent for the end user device to be able to grant that consent to track. That's the app tracking transparency framework that Sara mentioned. That is not a requirement to include within the app binary in your app's code when you present a app user experience to your user. You optionally can include that ATT framework that does make the IDFA available, which honestly is not a big departure from 2014 when the IDFA was released. If you get the IDFA on both the supply side and the demand side, deterministic measurement can still happen, and it's still blessed by Apple. So of the app developers who have decided to implement the ATT, or the app tracking transparency framework, and again, this is just our purview, this is the vantage point we have from our ecosystem, is 17% of app developers in Q1 2022 implemented the ATT framework, meaning they prompted the users to get that consent. And then in Q4 of this year, we've actually seen more than a quarter of apps are submitted with the ATT framework included, meaning more people are requesting for that IDFA. So of the apps that are asking, how many of the users are saying yes to that app developer? Well, it's about half. So it started just below 50% in 2022, Q1. And then this year, we're actually seeing more people giving consent to that app developer to track than not giving consent if they're asked. Now, the very bottom row of that chart is actually the overall picture of our total app traffic. So it's relatively low, meaning the IDFA is not present in the majority or 90% of the requests we get, but that's largely a function of app developers that we have just choose not to ask for attribution and rely on SCAD. So we'll go into SCAD a little bit in greater detail here in a couple minutes, but this is the picture of the app developers who are leveraging the app tracking transparency framework.
Awesome. So just to dig in a little bit more about how attribution has been happening, since app tracking transparency rolled out, in those cases where folks don't opt into that handy little box and say that they could be tracked. One thing that's really softened the blow of ATT is probabilistic attribution. And probabilistic attribution comes in a number of different shapes and sizes, but probably the predominant method used relies on something called fingerprinting. And it's really kind of helped shield marketers from some of the full effects of ATT at this point, because it's the closest to the legacy ways of doing things, where we did have an identifier available as a connective tissue, across all those media partners and conversion events that occur. However, this has been sort of a hotly debated topic for years, is that Apple actually has in their developer policies that fingerprinting is not allowed. And it's become sort of an annual tradition at their worldwide developer conference at this point that somebody draws the short end of the stick and has to get on camera and wag their finger and say that, you guys cannot do fingerprinting. This year, that's Tony Tan from, he actually introduced the privacy manifest that I mentioned earlier. But the interesting thing about it is that to this point, they've not really enforced this policy about fingerprinting. So it's sort of a scenario of make hay while the sun's shining, which makes perfect sense. However, some of the changes that we're looking ahead to in 2024 looks like that might be starting to come to an end.
So Advertiser Perceptions did some research for InMobi back in September, where we asked our panel whether they were aware that probabilistic attribution, also known as MMP attribution, may be considered fingerprinting. And almost half of them were blissfully unaware that probabilistic attribution could indeed be considered fingerprinting. You can see half said they are aware. Another 1/3 said they weren't aware of this, even though they think they know what fingerprinting is. And again, this is among advertisers that have a mobile app. So mobile app advertisers who theoretically should be the best informed as to what is or isn't fingerprinting in this ecosystem.
Okay, so we should probably pause here and just fill everybody in, those half-ish app marketers that aren't real familiar with what it is on what fingerprinting is. So fingerprinting is essentially a way to probabilistically identify someone without having that true identifier. It's an educated guess per se. And it uses a number of different signals. It tends to rely on IP address as one of the sort of pillar signals, and then keeps layering on other signals on top of that, like things about the handset, the time zone, different user preferences, or what type of connection that they're using, or their mobile carrier. And the more of these parameters that get layered on, the more educated of a guess that can occur. It often isn't called fingerprinting in the wild. It does just sort of get referred to as probabilistic attribution, or in some cases, MMP attribution or predictive models. And so why all the fuss about fingerprinting? Apple's not been enforcing their policies prohibiting it. So just a little bit about some of those factors there. So number one, it's not privacy safe. That's really the issue at hand here. Users aren't able to give consent. They're not able to opt out. They don't know that it's going on. So that's certainly problematic from the standpoint of protecting consumer privacy. Number two is the fact that it relies on IP addresses heavily as sort of a unique identifier that then other information gets layered onto. And IP addresses are not the most persistent or individual type of identifier. When somebody moves, from their home to their car, driving around, pinging different mobile towers, a lot of different people could be pinging that tower and all having the same IP address. And as you keep traveling throughout your day, connecting to a hotel, IP address changes and you can be sharing it. So obviously, not the ideal case for trying to identify someone. And then next, it's probabilistic, not deterministic, which I think all of us are kind of data junkies. So we want the more deterministic data that we can get. And then lastly, of course, the policies. So Apple, I already mentioned, has their policy, but it is actually part of Google's policy as well. So now I'll go into, what's changing on the horizon that may impact, whether or not fingerprinting is going to be able to thrive on iOS into the future. So this past summer, Worldwide Developer Conference, I mentioned Tony Tan, he introduced privacy manifests. And this does seem to be a marker of potentially the beginning of the end for fingerprinting. So this actually builds upon the privacy nutrition labels that apps have in the App Store now that launched back in 2020. But now it's actually delineating what an app's privacy practice is versus any third-party SDK partners that it works with. Third-party SDKs get bundled up with the app when it gets submitted. And so, everything was kind of lumped together, but now that's getting separated out, where in some cases, those SDKs are going to have to account for, what type of data that they're collecting, what is the purpose of them collecting that data, whether or not, they are considered to be tracking users per the app tracking transparency policy. And then, who is getting access to that data, who's connecting to that data. And here's just zooming in a little bit of what that privacy manifest says. So that this happens in Xcode. And, just like I mentioned, it's looking at the what, and then the if it's linked to a user, and then is it used for tracking, and then the why. So in this case, the collected type of data is a user ID. Is this linked to a user? Yes, obviously, it's kind of right in the name. Is it used for tracking? No. And then what it is used for is for driving the functionality of the app and then adding some personalization to the user experience. So in this case, totally acceptable use case, no issues there. Now to kind of flip over and look at, how's Google looking at fingerprinting? I mentioned that they also have a policy like Apple, but in their case, they've not needed to enforce that policy because there's really no reason to fingerprint on Android right now because we still have access to the Google Ad ID. But they've sort of taken a different tack in that they've deployed, or they actually have deployed the solution already. It's just that it doesn't need to be used yet, but it's a technical approach, where they are actually segregating out the apps data from the third-party SDKs. They're each in their own runtime environment. And so they can have their own data access to different things. The app owner is going to have the highest level of access, and then certain things SDKs won't be able to get to. So, before packaged together, now they're going to be separated, as Android Privacy Sandbox marches ahead.
So some of the other things that we asked our panel about their understanding of app advertising, fingerprinting, and Apple's policies, we asked them here whether they were familiar with Apple's plans that, as Sarah has described, were announced last June at the Worldwide Developer Conference, that they were going to start cracking down on fingerprinting next year through privacy manifests. And more than half of advertisers said they're at least somewhat familiar with this. But that does leave a substantial share who were either marginally aware or even not at all familiar. And overall, only 1 in 20 said they were very familiar with this plan. Okay, so what are mobile app advertisers using today for measurement? About 2/3 of them are using SK Ad Network, whether that's alone or, for most of them, in combination with probabilistic attribution. About a quarter said they're still using only probabilistic or MMP attribution. So for that group that's not using Scan yet, we asked them why not. The most common reason is that it's simply easier not to. It's easier to just use MMP or probabilistic attribution. And almost half of advertisers who say they're not using Scan say that's why. We did also find about 3 in 10 said that Scan performance was lower and the costs were higher. And a similar share said that Scan is just too complicated. 1 in 5 also said Scan doesn't give them visibility into ROAS. But again, that easy button is the most common reason these holdouts cite for not adopting SK Ad Network.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about when all of these changes go into effect with a little bit more granularity. So I mentioned, privacy manifests, they were announced in the summer. They came out in iOS 17, but there's really no ramifications just yet. What could be happening, and maybe some of you on the line have had this occur and would love to hear from you what that experience was like, but Apple has said that they would start sending out warnings to app developers when they suspect that one of their SDK partners might be leveraging data in a way that could be used for fingerprinting. But then next spring, there's not a more specific date than that, but they said next spring, they're going to start enforcing the rules around privacy manifests, and it will start impacting, the app review process. So anytime that a new app gets submitted or an app gets updated, and there's some suspicions that, something isn't totally up to snuff with the privacy manifests of SDKs, then that could slow down the app review cycle or even keep an app from being in the App Store. Then when it comes to Google, like I mentioned, SDK runtime, it's a functionality that exists, just isn't used today. The privacy sandbox testing is actively ongoing now and making good progress. And then if all goes well, Google Ad ID is going to be gone by the end of next year, and fingerprinting won't be an option. So we'll have to rely on, privacy sandbox and its attribution framework as the way to measure campaign performance in a deterministic way on Android.
Awesome. So zooming in on the iOS portion of that previous graphic, I'm going to explain this chart just a little bit here. So on the left, we have the total addressable universe of installs on iOS that we saw. And then on the bottom, we have a time series chart starting in 2020, kind of when all these announcements came together from Apple. So on the top, we have ASA, which stands for Apple Search Ads. This is Apple's growth product that they make available. They have 5 native platforms that have inventory within Apple Search Ads. The next far left option is self-attributing networks. Those are known as the large, sometimes referred to as self-reporting networks as well. They're the super publishers like Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Google, who dictate attribution versus send us clicks and impressions to do attribution. And then you got probabilistic, which Sarah focused on earlier, and then IDFA, which is now really only possible if the developer gets that consent from that user. So one of the interesting parts of this graphic, sorry, thanks. So one of the interesting parts of this graphic is you can see the date that Sarah called out in spring of 2021. April, the end of April, beginning of May was when iOS 14.5 was released. And that was really the tipping point for when the ATT framework had to be included in order to access the IDFA. So you can see the self-attributing networks that relied on that device ID for attribution. That's when their market share of total addressable installs really took a decrease because they all of a sudden were not able to do their claiming jobs as they historically had. So this impacted everything from their machine learning, their performance. It was really disruptive to those large partners. You probably recall the stock market for those folks around that time. And then Apple SCAD network, that is the next one to call out, is that grew at that moment in time because that's when people realized they had to rely on it. So if you go to the next slide, Sarah, it decomps that purple bucket where we look at SCAD adoption by version. And this takes a look at the transactions that we see in the SCAD version that accompanies them. So as you can see, we're still almost exclusively getting SCAD version 3. That was the moment in time when we saw a renewed advertiser and publisher investment in SCAD. And people learned a lot with that SCAD. They optimized against those models. They started to understand return on ad spend. And then you see a little highlighted area right at the end, which is SCAD 4 on the bottom right. That is Apple's new SCAD version, where they introduce things like course conversion value and differential privacy-based crowd anonymity. And those are complicated concepts, and it really disrupted all the learnings that were derived in SCAD version 3. So people are just getting started wrapping their heads around it from an adoption perspective. To Sarah's point earlier, they have just released SCAD 5. And I know we're not doing predictions yet, but I predict it will be slow to adopt because people are still trying to figure out a migration from 3 to 4. So I think it'll be some time before 5 gets traction. We actually may not even see traction on 4. People will go from 3 to 5 and just leverage the capabilities for re-engagement on 5, while also incorporating the items in 4 that I mentioned. So kind of an unclear picture, but if we look at the laws of past, it gives us some good insight.
Okay, so with all this information we've shared, how can app marketers really get prepared for 2024? I mean, number one, we saw that, there are still some folks that haven't dipped their toe in the water yet with Scan. So now is a great time to accelerate those adoption plans and start dipping that toe in the water. Next would be, lean on partners with Scan expertise. I'm sure Mark probably feels the same as me, that a lot of our time is spent learning Scan and then also paying it forward and teaching folks and building it into the solutions that we deliver. So the good news is, you don't have to go it alone. It's a very complicated topic. Myself, I've got like an hour-long class that I teach on a regular basis. So maybe that'll be my next talk. But then next, take advantage of all the signals that are available to you while you can. The probabilistic attribution methods with fingerprinting. I mean, like I said, make hay while the sun is shining and test that alongside Scan. You don't have to do a direct cutover. It definitely makes the learning period easier, helps you translate, what the differences are to your business stakeholders, and won't make it so painful if that Band-Aid gets ripped off and probabilistic signals start to deteriorate further. And then next on the Android side, just stay apprised of what's happening with Android Privacy Sandbox and the timelines. Get a basic understanding of the fundamentals there, because there are quite a few differences versus how Apple has been addressing privacy on iOS. And be prepared if those timelines stick to start testing in 2024 with your partners. Now, with that, I'm hoping that some of the folks on the line might have some questions, and the team here would be happy to answer them, as many as we can. So I'll hand it back over to Marissa.
All right, thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I so appreciate you sharing all of that great information from the survey, and especially all of those details on fingerprinting and how to prepare for 2024. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So Sarah, Nicole, Mark, again, thank you. And as you said, Sarah, let's get to the questions, because we certainly have a few this afternoon here. All right, our first viewer asks, are there any nuances to call out in how different types of mobile apps are navigating data deprecation and privacy? Mark, I'll ask you first.
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's so much of a nuance for us as it is a general approach from our app developers, and it's one of caution and risk aversion. There's a lot up in the air at the moment. There's a lot in question. As Sarah mentioned, Apple has not yet enforced fingerprinting, but the implications and the potential consequences when they do are great and far-reaching. So we have found that advertisers have taken a risk-averse approach and worked with cross-promotional advertising, which allows for a different level of consent from the user because it's all contained within one app developer's experience with SCAD and with ATT opt-in. So generally speaking, risk aversion would be my response.
Adding to what Mark said, totally agree. App category has a lot to do with it, and what the business goals that they have in mind are. There are those more risk-averse types of apps, like finance, for example, that tend to play by the book. They're not comfortable in the gray areas. So they certainly take a much more cautious approach. And then some of the apps that are a little bit more, living on the edges or comfortable with gray areas are often those that might be ad monetized that care about user retention over time and some of the lower funnel KPIs. Because definitely one of the downfalls with SK Ad Network are some of the timing mechanics that really kind of take away that real-time feedback loop or even knowing exactly when a conversion happened. So that's been a pretty difficult problem for them to solve.
Yeah, and I would just echo Sarah there, both the app category in terms of, is this, a regulated industry? Is this a really risk-averse industry to begin with? And also the goals of the app. Some apps are ad monetized, some aren't. Some apps are themselves the core business and some aren't. So the goals that the app developers have, whether they are in turn serving advertisers, whether they're trying to drive installs of their own app or simply engagement, these all really affect the approach that advertisers take. Of course, also advertiser size plays a role. Something that we at Advertiser Perceptions have seen in a lot of our research, unsurprisingly, larger advertisers tend to be trying more things. Whether some of those are experiments that they'll eventually discontinue or not, they're simply doing more different things to combat things like MAID deprecation and cookie deprecation. Whereas those smaller advertisers, they may be nimble, but they just can't quite do as much because of resource constraints.
All right, all good points. Thank you for sharing all of your takes on those nuances. For the next one, Sarah and Nicole, I'd love your perspective on this. Are there any major misconceptions to clear up about how Apple or Google are approaching privacy on mobile?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start there. Yeah, I would say that the biggest misconception right now is that the sky is falling with no recourse or upside. There's no question that there's a lot of challenges and things that we collectively give up, but there are actually some gains to be made that go relatively unnoticed because of the anonymized fashion of the attribution with scan. But there's insights there that come with a level of deterministic accuracy that we've really not had at our disposal before. And the reason for that is because each scan postback is actually tied back to a user's Apple ID, which tends to follow them for the lifetime of being an Apple user across all of their devices, versus, as good as the IDFA was at connecting events, across different media partners and such, it didn't stay with users across devices. It could be reset. So, having that Apple ID as the backbone, is a really, really durable identifier that we've not had access to before. So it certainly is a new level of deterministic attribution. And then another misconception, and this again goes to Apple, is that a lot of folks think that scan postbacks are aggregated, but they are actually at an individual level. It's just you don't know who that user is. Their identity is hidden for privacy purposes.
Yeah, those are two really good call outs, Sarah. I'd also mention too, first on Google, I still talk to people super regularly who think that the changes that Google has been talking about aren't really going to happen. I think you should disabuse yourself of that if you're still feeling that way. These changes will happen. With respect to Apple, I think there is still just a real lack of education around SK Ad Network in general. Sarah just gave one specific example, and I think it's a really great example. I've certainly heard it a million times, people talking about scan attribution being reported in the aggregate simply because you don't have visibility into who the specific user is. I also very regularly see research among advertisers who think that you can use scan for targeting as opposed to just measurement and attribution. So really kind of basics that people still have to learn about SK Ad Network. Maybe they should take your hour-long class for that, Sarah.
I'm available for hire or for free. I like you.
All right, thank you both for that. The next question is, in terms of foot traffic attribution, what is the best solution in the future for cross-device attribution if common probabilistic isn't available? Sarah and Mark, I think you both will have a nice perspective on this one. Sarah, you want to take that first?
Yeah, I don't really dabble in that too much today. I have a background in digital out of home. Maybe Mark has more to add on that one. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the digital out of home space is interesting and it's growing as mobile marketing gets more challenging. People are looking to diversify ad spend, and we're really seeing a growth in two sectors. The first one is OTT CTV spend, and then the second one is digital out of home, which you just mentioned. And I think it has to be acknowledged that those signals, if they're not consented to, will be harder and harder to come by, making that measurement harder and harder to perform. So if you are performing those kinds of measurement, my suggestion would be is to validate the source of that data to ensure the integrity of the measurement being performed.
Thank you. We were just talking about scan. So can you talk a little bit more about scan re-engagement capabilities coming in the future?
Yeah, I can start with that one if that.
Okay.
Sure. So in short, we don't know. As Sarah mentioned, it's in beta for an operating system version that it has not been released to a gold standard yet. So we have not been able to test with it as a mobile measurement partner. We've certainly read and consumed all the specs. We've looked at how it might inform our conversion models, but testing won't be possible until it's out of beta and released in a general application. But I suspect, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it'll be largely testing. I don't think that it will hit scale until people are ready to get off of SCAD version 3, which I think will take some time. But it is exciting that they did allow for re-engagement. It's been an ask for quite some time for app developers.
Yeah, I would agree that that's been one of the biggest pain points or drawbacks of scan is not, being able to have any meaningful re-engagement tracking. In scan 4, you get 3 separate postbacks now, or potentially you get 3 separate postbacks that follow different stages in the conversion funnel. So you at least know something deeper into the buyer's journey, but scan 5, which we know next to nothing about other than that it is coming supposedly this year, but I have my doubts at this point. But that was really the big change. They mentioned that it would still have 3 postbacks, which is one of the big new features that came with Scan 4. But now there will be some level of support for re-engagement. So I think we're all kind of on pins and needles, just waiting to learn more about what shape that takes.
Okay, thank you. So, as folks look ahead for 2024, what should app marketers look for in performance media partners and mobile measurement platforms? Sarah, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I can start. Yeah, it's really about finding the right expertise. This is painful stuff to learn. It's very complex, and Apple's documentation leaves a little bit to be desired from an SK ad network standpoint. Google has been a little bit more forthcoming and user friendly, at least in how they're positioning things. But yeah, it's finding those right partners, both from the expertise standpoint, but also from the technology vision. We live on an infrastructure today in the legacy way that all relies on ID. And that comes with a lot of technical debt. So folks that are sort of making that transition or building new innovation from scratch, which is the case at InMobi. We built a dedicated bidder for iOS specifically to support scan, where no IDs ever enter the system and only privacy safe signals get used. So finding those type of partners that are really kind of looking around the corner and planning ahead, I think is really important.
Yeah,
Mark,
just to
any
add on.
thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, from an MMP perspective, SCAD was really interesting. It marked this divergence between kind of a passive listener that provided feedback of measurement to the advertiser and optimization signals to our DSP partners like InMobi. And it really created a scenario where all of a sudden MMPs are active participants in the measurement framework because we're the ones who had to manage the conversion values and let Apple's StoreKit ad network know that a conversion was taking place or there was something meaningful taking place on the device, that the marketer would like some feedback on the source of that. So it really was our introduction into being an active participant in measurement versus more of a passive provider of measurement services. And when Google released Privacy Sandbox, the aggregation effort is enormous to do it correctly. And so I think as more and more burden is getting put on individual app developers, MMPs are going to continue to play kind of a larger role. It's just kind of shifting, I think, in definition to what it historically has. But I think the importance is really still totally relevant to app developers.
All right, thank you. At the very end of your presentation, you did talk a lot about testing. So our next question asks, what tips can you offer to app marketers looking to test and accelerate privacy-minded app performance strategies? Mark?
So the biggest one for me is getting organizational buy-in. It's really hard to dip a toe into the water of this. You can't go in halfway with minimal resources. It won't have the results you want, and it will ultimately result in a work item or a work product that isn't as good as it could be had the proper education taken place of your organization, the proper buy-in to say, this is the way things are. We need to gravitate towards that because that is the option. If you don't have that and you try to go into it, it will not be fun. You will be on a lonely island quickly, whoever's driving that effort. So for me, really, organizational buy-in as a product manager, it's really important for me to get. So maybe that's why I gravitate towards that importance. But yeah, organizational buy-in.
Yeah,
I was just going to say that you talked a lot about testing and your key takeaways. So any other thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I know it's probably sound like a broken record here, but absolutely, test early, test often, work on investing in that institutional knowledge, across different departments. One of the trickiest things that I hear from a lot of app marketers is, how difficult it is to translate the new world versus the old world. Finance people are used to seeing a certain way of reporting, and well, that doesn't necessarily exist anymore. So that's again, like why it's so important to test, kind of the current world of doing things versus the more future forward privacy safe way of doing things side by side, so you can kind of bring them along and get the right level of buy-in and advocacy. And again, like there's no reason you have to do it alone. MMPs, like Mark said, like that they've become really important, more so important maybe than they were before, which sort of went against where mindsets were when this all started to unfold. Folks thought, oh, MMPs are going to become obsolete. But in reality, it's become just the opposite, and they've become even more of a strategic partner in helping unpack all of these things and help sustain the business.
All right, well, we are going to take one more question today, and being that we are almost at the end of the year, let's talk about the future. So I'd love to hear from each one of you. What makes you optimistic for the future of mobile? Nicole, let's start with you.
I mean, I think it's the consumer engagement, which is why we're all here talking about this at all. It's why advertisers gravitated so strongly to mobile over the past decade plus. Consumers continue to spend hours every day with their phones. They take them basically everywhere. And they consume all kinds of media on their phones now. Obviously video, especially short form video, has become absolutely massive on mobile. And that's super engaging for advertisers. So they like that as well. And then the other piece on the consumer side is that over, again, the past decade, consumers have continued to become more and more willing to spend money on their phones as well. So it continues to be a great place to advertise, even if maybe people are going to have to shift their typical way of doing things. Maybe there will be, painful transition here, but the reality is that the reason advertisers like mobile is because of that consumer engagement. And if anything, that's only going to get stronger as consumers feel more respected and like their data is protected and kept private.
Sarah, what are you excited about?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic in general, and reassured because we've been through transformations like this before. Anybody who's been around as long as I have probably remembers when mobile first became pervasive, and what's called like dumb phones or flip phones, feature phones. And then BlackBerry emerged as the dominant smartphone player, and it was really hard to envision a world where that wouldn't be the case. And here comes the iPhone back in 2007. And, there was a lot of eye rolling and skepticism at that point that would really ever hit critical mass, let alone, take over for a lot of the tasks that we were used to doing on our desktop devices. Yet, here we are today where you can do basically anything digital on your phone, and it's become really the most ubiquitous channel that there is. Like everybody has one. It's with them all the time. You can reach pretty much everybody in the world. So there's really too much to lose and too many smart people out there to let things kind of fall by the wayside. And innovation's exciting. So, I'm really excited to be part of this sort of transformation that's underway, in whatever small way that I can.
Love that. Mark, what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, Sarah said it well, but said another way, and I'm optimistic for a lot of the same reasons, is the air in the balloon will not decrease. It will just shift as one part gets squeezed and it will go into the other part. So when that transition happens, that disruption creates opportunity. And I think if people are open to trying new forms of inventory, new forms of measurement, if partners are up for working with us to create new machine learning algorithm optimization strategies, those are all things that we can work together on and really create a potential solution that embraces that disruption and really makes the most out of it. Beyond that, and it could be related, I'm really interested in watching how LLMs are applied in our space. The explosion of AI has been crazy to watch from my perspective, and all of the quick iterative learnings and applications that it facilitates. So how LLMs are applied within individual businesses is something that I'm super excited about watching and see how that evolves.
All right. Well, great to end on that positive note and hearing all about what you three are excited for in the year ahead. Sarah, Nicole, Mark, that was such a wonderful way to wrap up our 2023 Tech Talks. Thank you so much for being with us, for the great content, and for answering all of those great questions from our audience. So appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Marissa.
So before we wrap up, I'm just going to take a moment to tell you about what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for live analyst and Tech Talk webinars in 2024 on our events page at emarketer.com/events. On the audio side of the house, don't forget to tune into Behind the Numbers, which is our daily podcast. And finally, please check out our newsletters. Thank you all for your time. And thanks again to Sarah, Nicole, Mark, the team at InMobi, and our Studio II crew, our production team behind the scenes, for making this webinar possible. Happy holidays to all of you, and we'll see you in the new year.